the thing about these films, Spitfire, Lancaster, and now Mosquito, is they tell more than just the story about the airplane. They're about the people, and the airplane is just the vehicle by which we tell the stories. He said, "Do you think there'd be any interest in making a feature doc about the Spitfire?" And I said, "Yes." We've done one Merlin, we've done 4 Merlins, now we're going to 2 Merlins.
Welcome to the Fighting High podcast. It's Sean Feast in the seat today, and I have with me David Fairhead, film editor and film director. Now, some of you may know David for being the director of Spitfire, the award-winning documentary, and more recently, Lancaster. So, hello, David.
Hello, Sean.
Now, David, tell us something about yourself. How on earth did you get into film in the first place?
Well, my parents always had a cine camera. Back in the day, it wasn't a video camera, it was a little film camera, clockwork film camera. And I loved seeing the results of that when my parents filmed stuff, and they belonged to this cine club and they made little film projects and what have you. So I kind of grew up with it around me, but without realizing this. You know, it's funny how things fall into place later for you. And they always shot films when we went on holiday and that kind of stuff. And it was always very exciting to get the little yellow Kodak package back. And my dad would set it up in the projector and we'd watch it. The usual kind of shaky cam footage of us goofing around. But it must have planted a seed, and I think my parents must have recognised that, because when I was 14 for Christmas, my dad bought me 2 rolls of Kodachrome film. And with a bunch of friends, we set about making a film, which of course we never finished. But I think by then, it definitely sort of unconsciously or subconsciously had set me on this path. And so when I got to age 16, choosing A-levels, one of the A-levels was a newfangled subject then called communication studies. And you had to do a project as part of this A-level. And one of the projects was make a film. I suddenly thought, oh, I could do that. And I misread the question. What it said was, the question was, make a 3-minute section from a 20-minute film. But I made the 20-minute film, and I finished it, and it most definitely had, it wasn't just a seed that had been planted then, it was something that sort of was beginning to flourish. I thought I could do this for a job, because generally what most people think is other people make films, and that's what we always think. And suddenly I realized that's what I could do. So I then went to a college, or it's now a university, but back then it was a college, and I did a degree in film studies. This is down in Canterbury, and I was on the road then.
Tell us something about what film editing actually is and what it entails.
Well, film editing is a really interesting thing. Everyone thinks you just it's a matter of throwing away all the bad bits and somehow the good bits are left and there's a film. And the opposite is true. It's about telling a story, essentially. And it's the only craft that's unique to filmmaking, because it involves using pictures and sound and putting them into an order. And it's actually about building something up rather than, reducing it to just taking out the bad bits. And it's a constantly fascinating and challenging job. Every day is different. And I've absolutely loved it for the 41 years that I've been doing it.
Now, you're also a film director. Does it help the knowledge that you've accrued over the past few decades in film editing? To what extent does that help you as a film director?
I had always, I suppose, wanted to direct, and I'd read somewhere that editors make the best directors, and everyone says, "Look at David Lean, he was an editor, and look how well things turned out for him."
Yeah. What happened to him?
Yeah, I don't know. He didn't amount to anything. So I always had that at the back of my mind, and I'd always thought about films I'd love to make and what have you. But when you're building a career, you can't always it's great to have dreams. Don't get me wrong on that. But at the same time, you need to earn money to pay the rent and all the rest of it. So sometimes those dreams get a little bit parked. But I always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to make films. And in the early, so around about 2000, actually, I managed to get a couple of short sort of arts documentaries commissioned that I'd plugged away at. And that gave me a real taste of, well, I do really like this. But it was actually being the director on those films informed me hugely about my editing as well, because I saw it from a different point of view. And so that was a really useful exercise. And then so I always had ideas sort of on the back burner, but I'd never really managed to do anything with them. So to answer your question, editing is it's a fantastically useful background to becoming a director, because you understand how films are put together. And one of the key things for a director when they're filming is to provide enough coverage to edit into a sequence, because sequences are how films are put together. They're short scenes that build to make the whole film. And so if you have that understanding, that knowledge of what you need to tell the story, then that really helps.
Sure. Now, your name is synonymous with Spitfire. Now, remembering the listener can't see what I'm looking at the moment, which is a room where the Spitfire does somewhat dominate. Where did your love of aircraft come from?
My love of aircraft came again from my childhood, and very much from my dad and my granddad. My granddad was too old to serve in the war, but he worked in an aircraft factory building Halifax bombers. This is in North London. In fact, it was part of the sort of London transport contribution to the war effort. They had a factory that was, they built Halifaxes there. So I was always very excited by that, and my dad had been in the RAF and for his national service, and so it was just one of those things. I just grew up with it, and so I was always fascinated by planes. I just loved them, the excitement of them. Growing up in that era, there were always war films on TV. 633 Squadron, Battle of Britain, all these movies, the Dam Busters, all these movies that. So it was just. I was just kind of steeped in it. I didn't have a chance, but I just loved them, and I joined the Air Cadets for a while. Ended up, funnily enough, in the Army Cadets. I loved that kind of military history, and I loved airplanes and aviation history, and so I just built up a knowledge, probably very much like you. That has stayed with me all my life, and at times it's been, certainly when I was a student, I didn't tell my fellow students all about this because it's so nerdy, not cool. But in later life, I've just had to embrace it and admit that, well, that's who I am.
Yeah. And how did Spitfire actually come about? Was this your idea? Did someone come to you with the idea? So talk us through that.
The way that Spitfire came about was through a great friend of mine, colleague who became a friend, called Anthony Palmer. And I had started editing what are called feature documentaries. So these are documentaries made for the cinema. The first one I've made was called In the Shadow of the Moon, or edited In the Shadow of the Moon. And I had started. I built up a bit of a sort of portfolio, if you like, of these. And Ant and I used to meet every now and again for a beer and a catch up. And he was arranging one of these catch-ups, and he said, there's something I really want to talk to you about. So we met at my local pub down the road, the Barley Mow, and it was a summer's evening, and we sat outside the pub, and as the sun set, we started chatting about a project that he'd been approached about, which was he made sort of, if you like, character-driven documentaries for telly, and he'd been asked if there was there might be a what was called a docu-soap series based around an airfield down in Kent, Headcorn. And so he went down there and he met some of the people who worked there, and he thought, well, there's enough really great characters. There's a skydiving school, there's the people who work in the tower, there's the people who do the maintenance. He thought this could all be great. And then the guy who was showing around said, now come and have a look at this. And he opened the hangar doors, and sitting inside it was a Spitfire. And Anne is not an aviation enthusiast, or at least he wasn't then. And he said he'd never seen anything so amazing. It had sitting there in the hangar, half in the gloom. It had this presence which he'd never thought a machine could have. And so when we met up at the pub, he said to me, "Do you think there'd be any?" He told me the story, and he said, "Do you think there'd be any interest in making a feature doc about the Spitfire?" I said, "Yes," because I'd had a similar idea about 5 years before, which we tried to, in fact, we'd sent it to Channel 4, but as ever, "Oh, no, we're not interested. Their young people don't like that kind of thing, or we don't think they'll like that kind of thing." So I'd kind of binned that idea. And when Ant said this, I thought, wow, yes, I do think there'd be interest in a film about this. And if I've got someone to do it with, we could at least stand a chance. Because normally you plug away with these ideas that stay on the back burner, and if you're incredibly lucky, maybe something will happen. But when it's just you doing it, it's a bit of a slog. But when there's somebody else who's prepared to get involved as well, then it makes it so much easier. And so Ant and I there and then decided that, okay, we're going to do this. We didn't have any budget, but we knew the first thing we needed to do was get the interviews in the can, because the veterans at that stage, average age was about 93, 94.
Yes.
We'd missed the boat on a number of them. Certainly the really well-known ones were all long gone, Douglas Bader and what have you.
Yeah.
So we were looking at veterans like Tom Neal and Jeffrey Wellham, who were, well known within the small circle of aviation enthusiasts, but not really outside.
Yes.
Although Jeffrey Wellham's book had actually been a real
First Light.
That's right, had been a real breakout success. But anyway, so we got in touch with the Battle of Britain Fighter Association, which is a group that looks after the veterans and kind of managed them in a way, acted as kind of gatekeepers. And so we contacted them, and they put us in touch with, who was the first person we interviewed? Can't think. Was it? Might have been Paul Farnes. I think there was one before that. But anyway, we did a practice interview with a friend of my dad's who flew Typhoons and Tempests, and a guy called Ron Pottinger. And the idea was, I knew he'd never flown Spitfires, but it was just right. How do we go about doing this? How will it work? How do we set the interview up, do the framing, etc., and how do we do a real interview? So we went down he lived near Lewis. We went down to Lewis and did an interview with him, and he gave a really great interview, actually, to the extent that I thought, why can't we use this in the film? But anyway, these are the things you have to do, and that was where it all started. But because we didn't have any money, we were asking favors of, cameramen and what have you to help us shoot this thing. It was a slow and protracted process. But bit by bit, we managed to get people interested in it. And when we could show them the interviews, and, I cut some stuff together with some archive, because you can download archive film from the Imperial War Museum. It's all watermarked and everything, but at least people can see what you're trying to do. And we knew that we wanted to do it in a different way from the way that normally, documentaries on TV are told. Because it was a feature doc, we wanted it to have like a cinematic feel to it. We knew that we wanted to have to film with real aircraft. We didn't want to do it with CG. Through circumstance, I found some of John Dibb's footage that he'd filmed for an auction site, actually, the Spitfire that was being auctioned. And it was so just head and shoulders over everything else I'd seen. So we got in touch with him. He became interested in being part of it. And bit by bit, we started to build this team up. And then the first person who came in, because it's all funded by money, was a chap called Steve Milne, who I knew through post-production, because he was still running at the time, a company called Molyneux in the West End as a post-production company. But he also had a film production company called British Film Company, and he's of similar interests to you and I. And his father had been in the Royal Air Force. In fact, he had been the chief technical officer at the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight for many years.
Yeah.
But he he wanted to be part of it, and he agreed to put money in. And so he put us.
We like him.
We do like him. We like him very much. But it was, he was taking a big gamble, but he believed in us and he believed in the project. And so he put the money in. It allowed us to book the first aerial shoot. Dibsy came over from the US with a cameraman. We talked about how we wanted to do this. We had a helicopter to film from. We also had a fixed wing camera platform, because that was how he normally did his stills.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a big step up for him, because most of his work was stills as well. So we talked about how we want this footage to work. We don't just want a shot of an airplane out of a window. We want the aircraft to be doing things. And the big thing that we said to him was we wanted 3 Spitfires, not just 3 any old Spitfires. We wanted 3 Mark 1s, and there were only 4 flying in the world. And he said, okay. And then he suggested we film at Bicester, which is a former RAF airfield. It's one of the very few that are left with a grass airfield, which is how they would have been used in 1940, because most of them then had a runway put in. And one September day, we all traipsed up to Bicester, and we were waiting there. The helicopter was there, the Beechcraft was there, and we were waiting for these Spitfires to turn up. And then we got a call to say that there were only going to be 2 because one of them had a flat battery. And we said, oh, because we wanted 3.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reason we wanted 3 is because the standard tactical formation at the time was the Vic
3, yeah.
Vic 3. And then we got another call to say we fixed it. And what had happened is there was a little bulb in the gun sight which somebody had left switched on. And that had the battery. They switched it off, charged the battery, and then we heard the sound of these. Half an hour later, the sound of these approaching Merlins, and these 3 Spits came in, and it was the most incredible feeling to see that, because it meant the thing was real. And once we'd filmed that, we knew that we were always going to get more funding. It didn't mean it was easy to get that funding, but there'd been that much investment in it, and there was that much belief in the project that we knew we'd be able to press on.
Yeah,
and it wasn't easy. It was a real struggle. It took 5 years to make that film, but we got there.
Yeah, and it's proven very successful. The next project you moved on to, were there lessons that you learnt while you were making Spitfire that Lancaster has been able to benefit from?
Definitely. And it's mainly to do with finance.
Yeah.
Because Spitfire ended up costing more than it needed to.
Mm-hmm.
That was because of our inexperience. And although we worked with a lot of experienced people, filming airplanes is unbelievably expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And even during Spitfire, we did a second shoot with some Spits down over Beachy Head. And we managed that for probably a third of the price that we did the first shoot for.
Sure, right.
So so we all learned on the job. Getting those costs down was a really key thing. And we had a number of other producers, exec producers who came on to Spitfire as we were making it. In particular, Keith Haviland and Trevor Beattie. And they came across to do Lancaster as well. And, they helped us to try and keep those costs down and to keep us focused. One of the things we realized on Spitfire is that we were chasing every story we could find about Spitfires. And so we actually shot way too much. So on Lancaster, we were much more targeted. Although the funny thing is, we filmed far more interviews. But part of that was because there were 7 people in a Lancaster, 7 men in a Lancaster's crew, and just 1 person in a Spitfire. And so we knew we needed more contributors, because we also wanted to get this sense of this was the way of telling the Lancaster story was going to be, if you like, almost a mosaic. It wasn't just one person sitting in an airplane, fighting for their life or whatever they would happen to be doing. This was 7 guys in an airplane fighting together as a crew. So that was part of the thinking behind it. Right, this is it's a crew-based story, so everyone can contribute. So we filmed 38 interviews with Bomber Command veterans, basically, which was, when I look back at that now, it's incredible.
Yeah, it is actually. Yeah.
And there's only one left alive now.
Yeah. Out of those that you interviewed, crikey.
Yeah. But it was an extraordinary privilege, and part of the way we managed to do this, to pay Steve a compliment, when we were filming Spitfire, we went up to Coningsby and we filmed with the BBMF. We weren't going to do any flying with them, but we wanted to. One of the things we wanted to show was the contrast then and now. This was a thing that we kept thinking about. Doesn't really come across so much in the film anymore, but when we were filming it, it seemed to be really important. We wanted to make the contrast that the last flying, the last Spitfire in RAF service was actually the BBMF have. And we wanted to contrast that with the Typhoons at Coningsby. So we got some shots which showed that Spit. It was a Mark 24, I think, possibly, taxiing along past the row of Typhoons and what have you. So we did that, which was fantastic, and it did exactly what we wanted it to do. And then afterwards, we went into the crew room at Coningsby, and there was this chap there, very tall chap, with a veteran, and we got chatting, and that was Steve Darlow, and he was
he gets about that boy.
He does. But the person he was with was George Dunn, who was the last of those surviving
dear old George,
veterans. We got chatting about what we were doing and what he was doing and what have you. And he said, "Well, what's your next film?" And I said, "Well, we were thinking of doing Fortress, but we've all just been in the hangar there and seen the Lanc, and maybe we should do the Lanc." And the rest is history.
Yeah,
we did do Lanc, but Steve, we stayed in touch, and then he came on board into the film as a co-producer, and he really was the gateway. Just as we'd had the gatekeepers for the Spitfire veterans, we then had he acted as a gateway, not a gatekeeper, I must say. He opened his address book and he put us in touch with so many of these veterans. And that was really an amazing thing, because it just meant that was the most difficult thing, really, is how do you get in touch with all these really quite elderly people.
Sure.
And through Steve, and then using our own researchers as well, researchees, I should say, we found a whole number of others. Ant had put an advert in, there's an RAF kind of newspaper that comes out. He put some adverts in there and people got in touch and what have you. So that's how we built up to 38. But the prime mover was Steve.
Yeah.
But the next challenge for us really was, right, how do we put this together into a story, into a narrative? Because the more reading I did, and I felt like I already knew a lot about it, but the more reading I did, I realized the less I knew, because there's just so many sort of twists and turns to this story. It's almost like a legendary tale, because there are so many things that fall into place. You have the terrible start to the war, the way that Bomber Command was unable to find its targets or not even get a bomb within 5 miles of the target. You had then, when Harris came in, you had the advent of the Lanc as well, and at the same time you had the advent of new navigational methods like G, and suddenly a corner starts to be turned. And so I had to reflect that in the way that I was doing the editing. And Ant and I worked on this, for such a long time. The film took, a year to edit, which is much longer than you would normally spend on a documentary. Your budget normally doesn't spread that thin, but we did a lot of this during the pandemic, and there was no work anyway. So I would edit it, and then Ant would review it remotely, and that's how we started to shape the story. And with 38 interviews, we had a lot of material, but bit by bit we started to bring it down, and then we could focus on what were the elements of the story we wanted to tell. For instance, the early years of the bombing campaign, and we had interviewees like David Fraser, who was a rear gunner in a Wellington who got shot down, and that was just fantastic the way he told that story. And it became a really enjoyable thing to reflect the twists and turns of the narrative with what our veterans were telling us. And eventually all leads towards the sort of, the Battle of Berlin, and then Nuremberg, and the horrors of that. And so for every step forward that Bomber Command were making with their advances, with navigational technology and tactics, the enemy, the Luftwaffe, was making corresponding steps as well. And so ending on that night with the terrible losses over Nuremberg. And again, that in the narrative itself, that becomes a turning point, because that takes us into D-Day, and then the turn in the war, and then the increasing accuracy of Bomber Command's attacks. But then, strangely, how they reverted back to night attacks, and that leads to Dresden. And Dresden in itself is the kind of full stop for us to the war. We don't need to tell any more of that story beyond that, because of course it remains controversial, and that was one of the challenges for the storytelling in the film. How do we relate this story that so many people have an opinion on? That's the funny thing we used to say about Lancaster. There are two Ds that people know about the Lancaster, the Dam Busters and Dresden, and that's it. So for us, it was a challenge to tell, in particular, the Dresden story, from the point of view of our interviewees, about what they knew at the time and how they felt about what they were doing. And then we had the amazing interview with our German civilian, who had, as a child, had witnessed the bombing. So that allowed us to tell the other side of the story as well. So all in all, it was a really fantastic exercise to try and to tell that extraordinary and enormous and sprawling story in what turned out to be an hour and 50 minutes.
Well, the result is everything, because it is a magnificent film. So if anyone hasn't watched it, I strongly urge you to watch it. As you say, 37 interviews, 38 interviews, just extraordinary. And they are, to all intents and purposes, the last voices of Bomber Command, pretty much. Now, I know there's another potentially exciting project in the offing at the moment, because I've been privileged to be able to see a little bit of the trailer for it. But tell everyone what you're currently working on and working towards at the moment.
Right. Well, as I like to tell people, we've done one Merlin, we've done 4 Merlins, now we're going to 2 Merlins. So it's Mosquito. It's quite a funny thing, because when we did Spitfire, everyone said, "You're going to do the Hurricane story now," and I thought, well, haven't you watched the film? Because the thing about these films, Spitfire, Lancaster, and now Mosquito, is they tell more than just the story about the airplane. In fact, in some respects, they're not even about those airplanes. They're about the people, and the airplane is just the vehicle by which we tell the stories. So a lot of the veterans we interviewed in Spitfire had actually flown Hurricanes as well, particularly the Battle of Britain pilots. Mm-hmm. So Paul Farnes had flown Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain. Tony Pickering had. So although they went on to fly Spitfires later, in that most crucial time in 1940, they had flown Hurricanes because there were more Hurricanes around. So Spitfire told the story of the Spitfire and the Hurricane pilots as well. But with Mosquito, funnily enough, this is where it all starts to come together, I think. And as a trilogy of films, it was never planned as a trilogy. In fact, we never thought. It's not true. We did think beyond Spitfire, what's next? As I mentioned earlier, we were thinking of doing the B-17 as Fortress, because we knew that would have a market in the US.
Yes, yeah, fair enough.
But we didn't, because we went to do Lancaster instead, because we'd seen that airplane and we thought, wow, this is an amazing thing. So we did that, and just as well we did as well, because COVID came along, and there's no way we could have gone to the States to interview American veterans. Whilst we were making Lancaster, I did have the thought about making Mosquito, partly because when we interviewed George Dunn, Steve had told me that George had flown mosquitoes. So I asked him a little supplementary question when we were doing that interview for Lancaster, and his eyes absolutely lit up. And he just waxed lyrical about the mosquito. So I knew there was something there, and there was one interviewee we could come back to record. So moving on to Mosquito, Steve Darlow again was very, very helpful and very interested. He wanted to make this thing happen, and so he's stayed on board as a co-producer with that. And then the other person who's made it possible is Ian Philpott, who's another friend of mine, who's a cameraman, director of photography. He did about half the interviews on Lancaster with Ant and I. And he's put so much time and effort into this as well. So I'd like to credit both of those guys for just sticking with it and believing in the project, because I really believe that we're going to get there. It's just a difficult process, as I keep saying. But with Mosquito, it feels like this is where it comes together, because it was such an extraordinary aeroplane, and it changed the way, I think, that their aircraft, in particular bombers, were developed. And certainly when it was first sort of pitched to the Air Ministry, if you like, and a bomber that was faster than a fighter, the Air Ministry said nonsense, that could never happen, and they didn't want to know anything about it. But the team at de Havilland really believed in that airplane, and they believed they could make it faster, they could make it lighter, because they were going to build it of wood, not of metal. But it wasn't like blocks of wood. This is today we would describe that airplane as being made of composites, because of the way that the wood was used. It was tiny, really, really fine 3-ply or 4-ply plywood, put over a former and held together with really cutting edge resins and glues. The balsa wood that everyone knows about was literally just used to fill out the skin and give it rigidity before the second layer of plywood went on. So incredibly innovative in the way it was put together. And because it was light, and because it had 2 Merlin engines, it was incredibly fast, and it could fly. The first, when they did the first tests, so beyond the prototype, they then went down to Boscombe Down and tested it down at Boscombe Down against the latest Spitfire then, which I think was a Mark V, and it was faster. And I think that's when the Air Ministry said, hang on a minute, we've got something here. Because at the time they were still thinking, well, let them build it and they can tow targets with it or something like that. Yeah. But instead it just became this absolutely incredible airplane that everyone wanted to fly.
Sure.
And it does make you think about how, if it had come earlier, or if more effort had been put into its development by the Air Ministry, it could carry a 4,000-pound bomb load to Berlin. The Lanc could probably take 8,000 to Berlin, but that's a big airplane with 7 men in it. The Mosquito had a 2-man crew.
Yeah.
So I think it changed the mindset about what bombers could be. And after the war, of course, the jet engine had come in. So piston engine aircraft were on the way out. But you look at airplanes like the Canberra, twin jet engines, 2, possibly 3-person crew, 3-man crew. So it did change that. And although the Americans, continued to build big airplanes, big bombers, the B-52 being the classic example, really, I think what the Mosquito did was make people look at how the bombers didn't need to be these really big airplanes anymore. They could be smaller and better.
Yeah. Well, I do know, and perhaps it's a conversation for a different podcast, but Donald Bennett, the head of the Pathfinders, I know, was on record saying that if he'd have had his time again, he would have equipped his force with all Mosquitoes straight off, because the casualty rate was that much lower. They were much more versatile in what they could do. And towards the end, with the light night striking force, he was putting up raids of 150 just Mosquitoes as a force. So they weren't used in sort of penny packets as people tend to think. I also love that bit about, was it Goebbels, the propaganda minister, who pointed to a Mosquito being made of wood as evidence that Britain was losing the war because they'd run out of metal.
Well, that's right. But then the funny thing is, Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, then said that he was jealous of the RAF, because they were making these things out of wood in any old piano factory. and they can afford metal better than us, but look what they're doing.
Yeah.
He said, after the war, he said, I will buy British radios, not German ones.
Oh dear. Timing on Mosquito, do we know? This is something I almost feel awkward asking you, because clearly it's going to come down to that vulgar thing, funding again, isn't it?
That's exactly what it comes down to. I feel optimistic. We've done probably all the interviews we're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
As I said earlier, that the average age of the Spitfire and Hurricane pilots was 93. The average age of the Bomber Command veterans when we did them was about 96.
Mm-hmm.
The average age of the Mosquito veterans now is 99.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, 2 of the interviews we've done have been with 102-year-olds.
Sure. Yeah.
So I can't imagine we're going to find any more. But we've got 14 RAF interviews in the can. So that's both air crew, ground crew, and WAFs. But we also have 6 interviews with Danish civilians, because one of the crucial bits of the Mosquito story, which you know very well,
yes,
you've written a book about it, was about how they were used in almost like a private war between 2nd Tactical Air Force and the Gestapo, and the best known of those raids is the raid on the Shell House at Copenhagen. And these interviews we did in Copenhagen last year were with now elderly people, 5 women and 1 man, but who have been children at the school that was accidentally caught up in that raid. And it tells such an extraordinarily powerful story. And that's in a way how this film will also move on from both Spitfire and Lancaster, and tells, if you like, a bigger picture story about the nature of war, because the nature of war is tragedy. And that was, I said earlier about how this film brings it all together, and it does in a way. But to answer your question, how long will it be till it comes out? Well, the way I have to look at it is that the other films both took 5 years each to make, through issues with funding, or COVID, or whatever it is. They take a long time. Lancaster took a year to edit, so it's quite a long time. With Mosquito, yes, we had a stumble at the beginning with trying to raise funding. Ant's not working with me on this one. He's decided he wants to take a step back because he's got a boat. But I completely get that. But he's there. He's backing me up. He's supporting me. He's going to do our the beautiful rostrum shots of the photographs and what have you again. Well, so we are going to work on it together. But he's not in the driving seat this time. He was always he and I were co-pilots on the last 2 films. But I've got the same exec producers interested in being part of it. So I feel positive about it. It's just going to take time. So we're in year 3 now. So if I said in 2 years' time, there's an answer.
David, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed. And we look forward to Mosquito as and when it appears.
Thank you, Sean. I'll be sure to let you know.
Thanks for listening to the Fighting High podcast. You can follow Fighting High on X using @FightingHigh. Visit fightinghigh.com for details about books, and follow the Fighting High publishing page on Facebook. If you have enjoyed this podcast, then please follow or subscribe and leave us a review.